This project will be finished on time if my son runs it. The words landed clean. Confident. Rehearsed. My name is Adrian Hale. I'm 44 years old, and I built Orion. And as usual, the story is a work of fiction created by our editorial team for storytelling purposes. All characters, events, and organizations are fictional. Any resemblance is purely coincidental. Thank you, and let's continue. The boardroom didn't react immediately. That's how power works. It waits to see which direction it's supposed to lean. Darren Kessler stood at the head of the table, palms resting lightly on polished walnut. Behind him, the Orion Grid Initiative timeline glowed across the screen milestone gates, funding releases, regulatory checkpoints, architecture I had designed down to the sequencing of environmental clearance timestamps. Miles Kessler, 28, Director of Innovation, stood near the wall, arms folded, wearing confidence like it had been tailored for him. Darren smiled. Not wide, measured. Acceleration is leadership, he said smoothly. Legacy friction is not. A few board members nodded. Someone tapped a pen against a legal pad. The applause wasn't audible, but it was there in posture. Then Darren turned to me. Which means, he continued evenly, your role is no longer required. No transition language, no soft landing, you're fired. Silence pressed in. $420 million of government-backed infrastructure funding sat behind those slides. Miss one compliance gate, and the funding didn't slow down. It froze. Miles stepped forward, voice bright. The system runs itself now. We're streamlining, cutting redundant verification layers. Redundant. He meant the secondary compliance gate, the external regulatory buffer, the risk checkpoint committee, the safeguards. I didn't argue. I looked toward the far end of the table. Samuel Rourke, founder, majority shareholder. 72 years old, hadn't spoken yet. He didn't blink when Darren made the announcement. He didn't defend me. Instead, he folded his hands. Fine, he said calmly. Give the project to your son. A ripple moved through the room. Then he turned his head slightly. Adrian, he said, voice low but unmistakable. Come see me. He hadn't challenged Darren. He hadn't reinstated me. He had allowed it. And that was the moment I recognized the smile Darren wore. It wasn't victory. It was exposure waiting to happen. Samuel Rourke's office didn't look like a CEO's suite. No glass walls, no skyline drama, just dark wood shelves. Framed newspaper clippings from decades ago, and a single blueprint of the company's first data center mounted behind his desk. He didn't sit when I entered. He closed the door himself. Sit down. Adrian. I remained standing for a second longer than necessary, then took the chair opposite him. You built fail-safes into Orion, he said. Not asking? Yes. How many? 3 primary? 2 secondary? He nodded once, almost satisfied. The board doesn't understand sequencing, he continued. They understand milestones. They'll understand suspension. I said evenly. A faint line appeared at the corner of his mouth, not a smile. Recognition. Did you anticipate someone trying to accelerate governance? Yes. And the system locks if compliance sequencing breaks twice. Funding freeze is automatic. No executive override. He leaned back slightly. Good. The word wasn't praise, it was confirmation. You're not reinstating me, I said. No. He didn't hesitate. You're not challenging Darren publicly. No. Why? He folded his hands. Because succession pressure reveals character faster than confrontation does. Silence stretched between us. He's pushing too quickly, Samuel said. And he believes control equals competence. And Miles, I asked? Believes speed equals leadership. I held his gaze. If they remove the secondary verification gate, the environmental clearance timestamp becomes vulnerable to missequencing. I know. And you're allowing it, I'm observing. The words settled heavier than dismissal. You want the system to speak, I said quietly. Yes. He stood, signaling the conversation was over. Do not interfere, he added. You built Orion to protect itself. And if it collapses, it won't collapse. He replied calmly. It will expose. As I reached the door, he spoke once more, and Adrian. I paused. Don't protect them from the consequences of their own architecture. For the first time since I was fired, I understood. This wasn't about my position. It was about proving whether structure mattered more than ambition. And soon, we were going to find out. Miles didn't waste time. By Thursday morning, An internal memo went out under his name, Orion Timeline Optimization Initiative. Optimization. That was the word people used when they were about to remove something they didn't understand. He called a town hall in the main conference space. Glass walls, projected slides, confident pacing. We've inherited unnecessary friction, he said, clicking through a deck filled with upward arrows and compressed timelines. Secondary verification gates, redundant environmental buffers, legacy oversight committees, redundant. I watched from the back of the room. He had removed the secondary verification gate between environmental clearance and funding submission, the external compliance review buffer that inserted a 48-hour validation window, the risk checkpoint committee that required cross-signature before milestone documentation was finalized. He called them legacy drag. He called them fear-based architecture. The board applauded the new projected milestone date. Darren stood beside him, proud, almost relieved. This is the kind of leadership we need, he said. Confidence, momentum. In regulated infrastructure, momentum was not a virtue, sequence was. Miles advanced to the next slide. We'll compress milestone reporting by 10 days, he continued. Environmental clearance confirmation can be logged concurrently instead of sequentially. Concurrent logging, I felt it immediately. If approval timestamps overlapped improperly, the government oversight body's audit algorithm would flag a sequencing mismatch, not fraud, not corruption, just missequencing. And in public-private partnerships, missequencing was enough. As after the meeting, a junior compliance analyst approached me in the hallway. Is this safe? She whispered. It's faster, I replied. That's not what I asked. I didn't answer. Because I wasn't allowed to interfere. Samuel had been present during the town hall. He hadn't interrupted. He hadn't endorsed. He observed. By Friday afternoon, the first milestone packet under Miles's revised architecture was submitted. I checked the documentation quietly. Environmental clearance, timestamp pending final registry entry, milestone submission logged, the order was inverted. The system noticed, and it remembered. The oversight body would too. What happens when documentation doesn't follow regulatory sequence? You don't get applause, you get questions. The email from the oversight body arrived. Monday at 8:14 a.m. Subject line, milestone documentation. Clarification required Orion Grid Initiative. Not an accusation, a question. Those were more dangerous. Miles forwarded it to the executive team with a short note. Minor timestamp alignment issue, already being addressed. Alignment. I opened the attached PDF. The oversight analyst had highlighted 2 entries. Environmental clearance approval logged 1432. Milestone submission logged 1358. Submission had preceded clearance. By 34 minutes, not fraud, not intentional, but in regulatory sequencing, order mattered more than intent. If documentation suggested a milestone was filed before environmental approval finalized, the funding authority flagged it as procedural breach. Funding didn't release on enthusiasm. It released on sequence. Darren called an executive huddle. I wasn't invited. But governance reports were still routed through system logs I had architected. I could see the internal revisions being attempted in real time. Miles spoke first in the meeting, his voice carried through the partially open conference door. This is legacy documentation lag, he insisted. The clearance was effectively granted earlier. The registry update just posted late. Martin from finance sounded less certain. The oversight body doesn't evaluate effectively, he said. They evaluate timestamps. Darren stepped in. We respond calmly, clarify the registry delay, emphasize that the project remains fully compliant. Compliant. The word meant nothing without order. By mid-afternoon, a formal clarification was sent. They framed it as administrative misalignment. The oversight body responded within the hour. Please confirm internal sequencing controls to prevent recurrence. Prevent recurrence. I looked down at the Orion architecture map on my tablet. They had removed the secondary verification gate, the one that forced environmental clearance confirmation to lock before milestone submission fields activated. Without it, concurrent logging was possible, which meant missequencing was inevitable. Samuel passed me in the hallway that evening. He didn't slow. First one. He said quietly, yes. And if there's a second, the funding release mechanism auto-suspends, I replied. He nodded once. He already knew. Upstairs, Miles was presenting revised milestone forecast to the board. The applause sounded thinner this time. The system had noticed once. If it noticed twice, it wouldn't ask questions, but it would trigger. The second discrepancy happened faster than I expected. 3 days after the initial clarification email, another milestone packet was submitted under the timeline compression framework Miles had championed. This time, the environmental clearance file existed, but the validation signature from the external regulatory buffer was missing. It was the very buffer Miles had removed, claiming it was legacy friction. The system didn't accuse. It calculated. In reality, my administrative credentials had been deactivated the moment I walked out of that boardroom in Chapter 1. However, Darren and Miles had made a fatal mistake common to politicians. They understood power, but they didn't understand architecture. When I designed Orion, I had embedded an emergency auditor key, an independent protocol buried deep within the secondary verification source code. Samuel Rourke was the only one who knew, and he had secretly kept it active under the guise of independent board oversight. It didn't grant me the power to edit, but it allowed me to observe every pulse of the system. And right now, my private laptop was lighting up with lines of red code. 10:42 a.m., the Orion governance engine logged the missing validation signature. 10:43 a.m., the system auto-referenced the prior sequencing variants from the previous milestone. 10:44 a.m. The compliance kill switch I had written 3 years earlier triggered 2 compliance chain breaks within 1 reporting cycle, initiate automatic funding suspension. No human intervention, no executive override, just logic and algorithms. At 10:45 a.m., a cold notification was transmitted directly to the government funding portal, milestone release status suspended pending governance review. The conference room down the hall went from a dull roar to a dead silence before exploding into chaos. Miles's voice cut through first, sharp and panicked. That's not possible. We addressed the last issue. Martin from finance was already frantically refreshing the dashboard. The funding is frozen, he said, his voice trembling. All downstream disbursements are paused. The system just auto-reported a procedural breach to the oversight body. $420 million doesn't disappear quietly. It freezes, dragging down an entire ecosystem of subcontractors and shareholder confidence with it. I sat motionless at my desk, looking out the window. Miles stormed past my office, face flushed with a mix of rage and fear. He was shouting into his phone. This is legacy contamination. The old architecture is fighting our optimization. No, the architecture wasn't fighting anyone. It was doing exactly what it was designed to do, prevent procedural drift from compounding into a regulatory disaster. Darren called an emergency executive meeting within the hour. For the first time since firing me, my name was mentioned again, but this time, the tone was different. Who authorized the removal of the secondary verification gate? Martin asked, his voice shaking. Silence followed. Because the system changelog, the one my auditor key was clearly displaying, didn't show Miles's credentials. It showed Darren's executive override. Darren had bypassed the governance amendment vote to accelerate succession optics. He had signed his own professional death warrant without even realizing it. Samuel Rourke entered the building 20 minutes later. He didn't rush. When he stepped into the boardroom, the noise lowered automatically. He looked at Darren, then at the screen displaying the status suspended. Why? He asked evenly. Was governance amended without majority consent? The question wasn't emotional. It was structural. And structure. Once compromised publicly, that does not defend anyone. The Orion system had spoken, and it spoke in the language of unyielding data. The boardroom was quieter this time. Not tense, measured. A forensic audit team had already been engaged before the emergency session began. Not external regulators yet, internal governance review. The kind that determines whether a mistake is unfortunate or structural. Samuel sat at the center of the table, Darren to his right, Miles 2 seats down, unusually silent. The audit lead projected the governance log onto the screen. Secondary verification gate removed under executive override, she said. Timestamp 3 weeks ago. The slide shifted. Approval credentials Darren Kessler. Miles straightened immediately. That was strategic delegation, he said. We discussed streamlining. The auditor didn't look at him. There is no record of board majority consent for governance amendment. She continued. Martin cleared his throat. Amendments to compliance sequencing require majority approval under Article 9. Samuel finally spoke. Why? He asked calmly. Was governance amended without majority consent? Darren held his posture, but his voice had lost its polish. It was temporary. He said, acceleration required flexibility. We were responding to political pressure around funding optics. Optics, Samuel repeated softly. Miles leaned forward now, trying to reclaim momentum. The architecture was overly cautious. We needed speed. The audit lead switched to the compliance variance timeline. First discrepancy flagged. Clarification requested. Second discrepancy triggered automated suspension per embedded rule set. She paused. The system functioned as designed. Silence followed. Not accusatory, conclusive. Samuel's gaze moved from the screen to Darren. Did you believe removing the secondary gate would not impact sequencing integrity? Darren hesitated. It was redundant. No, Samuel replied evenly. It was defensive. The word hung there, defensive. A system doesn't remove defense when funding is milestone-based and externally audited. It reinforces it. The audit lead advanced one final slide. Based on documentation, this is not fraud. It is procedural breach resulting from governance override without consent. She looked up. However, fiduciary exposure exists if governance was knowingly altered outside charter parameters. The air shifted again. This wasn't about acceleration anymore. It was about duty. Samuel folded his hands. Is this negligence? He asked quietly. Or breach of fiduciary responsibility? No one answered immediately. No one. Because in corporate governance, the difference between ambition and liability is one signature. And that signature was Darren's. The government notice arrived before the board adjourned, not an email, a formal suspension order transmitted through the funding portal. Milestone release suspended pending governance review. $420 million didn't disappear, but its next disbursement froze. Finance projections updated in real time. Liquidity forecasts tightened. Partner contingencies activated automatically. Within the hour, a major infrastructure subcontractor invoked its contingency clause. Payment assurance required within 10 business days. The stock price dipped before the markets even fully understood why. Darren stood at the front of the room, no longer polished. No slides this time. No narrative. Temporary disruption. He insisted. We're addressing sequencing concerns. Miles sat rigid beside him, staring at the funding dashboard like it might reverse itself out of embarrassment. Samuel didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. You accelerated succession at the expense of structure, he said evenly. Darren exhaled sharply. I accelerated delivery. No, Samuel corrected. You accelerated optics. Silence fell harder than before. Then Samuel turned toward me. Adrian, I hadn't been seated at the executive table, not formally reinstated. Just present. Explain, he said calmly. What would have prevented this? The room shifted toward me, not with hostility, with necessity. I stood. The Orion architecture required sequential validation. I said, environmental clearance confirmation had to lock before milestone submission fields activated. The secondary verification gate enforced that. I glanced briefly at Miles. When that gate was removed, a concurrent logging became possible. That made missequencing inevitable under compressed timelines. I didn't accuse, I described. The system detected 2 breaks in compliance chain within 1 reporting cycle. Under embedded rule, funding suspension triggered automatically. Darren's jaw tightened. So you designed a trap, he said. No, I replied evenly. I designed protection. Martin spoke next, voice measured. If the gate had remained, the second discrepancy would not have occurred. I said, submission would have been blocked until environmental validation finalized. A board member leaned forward. So this was preventable. Yes, not because Miles was inexperienced, not because Darren was reckless, because governance was altered without structural review. Outside the room, news alerts began circulating. Industry reporters were already requesting comment. Samuel rose slowly from his chair. This company was built on sequence, he said, not speed. He looked at Darren, then at Miles, then at me. And sequence, he continued, does not negotiate with ambition. The collapse wasn't explosive, it was procedural, which made it worse. No villain monologue, no dramatic confession, just documentation, and a funding freeze that would not lift until governance was restored. The room didn't ask whether I would return. It asked something else entirely. Who, now, controlled Orion? The reinstatement offer came quietly, not from Darren, from Samuel. We met again in his office, the blueprint of the first data center still framed behind him like a reminder of how this company had begun on engineering. Not ego. I'm reinstating you as head of strategic infrastructure, he said, effective immediately. No, I replied. He didn't look surprised. You don't want the title back, he said. I don't want the structure to depend on me, I answered. The funding suspension would lift once governance was corrected. The oversight body had already signaled conditional reinstatement if compliance controls were restored. Restored properly. What are you proposing? Samuel asked. Independent oversight charter, I said. Board-level governance review? Dual authorization compliance framework. No executive override without majority consent and documented risk exposure. I slid a document across his desk. I had drafted it the night before. You built this before you were offered reinstatement, he observed. Yes, why? Because the problem wasn't that I was fired, I said evenly. The problem was that governance could be altered by ambition. He studied the proposal in silence. Under the new structure, compliance gates could not be removed without board majority. Secondary verification reinstated permanently. Funding submissions required dual authorization, operational and governance sign-off. Succession authority decoupled from project oversight. And Darren, he asked, placed on leave pending fiduciary review. And Miles removed from project authority. Advisory role only. Samuel leaned back. This will cost you, he said quietly. He wasn't wrong. My equity bonus was scheduled to vest next quarter. Reinstatement under my old contract would preserve it. External governance appointment would not. You're walking away from 7 figures, he said. Yes, and the title. Yes, and he folded his hands. Why? Because authority that depends on employment can be removed, I replied. Authority embedded in charter cannot. He stood. Darren will be placed on administrative leave effective today. And Orion, I asked. Orion will report to governance, not to Darren, not to Miles, not to me, to structure. For the first time since I was fired. I didn't feel like I had regained something. I felt like I had redesigned it. The question now wasn't whether I had won. It was who truly controlled Orion. The press release was brief. Executive leadership update. Governance realignment. Effective immediately. Darren Kessler had stepped down for health reasons. Miles would transition to an advisory capacity within innovation. An independent oversight charter had been ratified by majority board vote. No mention of funding suspension in the headline. But everyone inside the company knew. The board session that followed was not dramatic. It was procedural. Article 9 amended. Executive override authority restricted. Secondary verification gate permanently reinstated. Dual authorization framework embedded into Orion's governance layer. The vote passed unanimously. $420 million does not tolerate ego twice. 2 days later, the oversight body confirmed conditional reinstatement of milestone funding, pending demonstration of restored sequencing controls. We submitted the revised architecture. This time, environmental clearance locked before submission fields activated. External validation buffer reinstated. Governance sign-off logged with dual timestamp authentication. The funding release portal updated at 11:16 a.m. Milestone status reinstated. No applause, just quiet relief. Samuel stood at the head of the boardroom one final time. Effective immediately, he said. Orion reports to the governance committee. Adrian Hale will serve as external strategic guardian with board-level authority, not employee, not executive, guardian. I no longer held an internal title, but I held structural veto authority over compliance modification. Miles approached me later that afternoon. You didn't have to dismantle everything, he said, defensive but subdued. I didn't dismantle anything. I replied, I restored sequence. He nodded slowly, absorbing what that meant. This wasn't about humiliation. It was about architecture, and the company hadn't been destroyed. It had been recalibrated. Darren was gone. Miles was sidelined. Funding resumed, and Orion finally answered to structure instead of succession. The question lingering wasn't whether I had won. It was whether anyone truly loses when governance corrects itself. 3 weeks after funding resumed, Samuel asked me to walk with him through the original operations wing, the part of the building that predated Darren. The press releases, the slide decks, concrete floors, exposed wiring, the company before polish. Do you know why Orion survived, he asked. Because the funding authority didn't terminate. I said, no, he replied, because the architecture refused to lie. We stopped beneath the framed blueprint of the first infrastructure build he had ever completed. Leadership isn't speed, he said quietly. It's sequence. I had heard him say versions of that before. This time, it landed differently. I didn't cause the collapse. I said, he nodded. I stopped protecting them from it. That was the part most people misunderstand. I didn't design Orion to fail. I designed it to refuse distortion. When Darren removed the gate and the system didn't retaliate, it recorded. When Miles compressed the timeline, the architecture didn't panic. It sequenced. Ambition moved quickly, governance moved correctly, and when the two conflicted, only one of them was embedded in charter. Darren's resignation faded into industry memory. Miles remained quieter now, more attentive to documentation than applause. Orion continued. Milestones released. Environmental clearance locked before submission. Dual authorization logged. No shortcuts. I never returned as an employee. I didn't need to. Authority written into structure does not depend on title. As I left the building that afternoon, I looked back once not at the boardroom, not at the executive floor, at the blueprint. Systems outlast ambition. Governance outlives ego. Succession cannot override architecture. And sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is let the system speak for itself. Thank you for listening. If this story made you stop and think, hit like to support, subscribe for more stories like this, and leave a comment with your perspective. We read. Everyone,